There's a moment, usually late at night, when the humiliation replays itself uninvited. Not the whole event, necessarily, just a fragment of it. The specific words, the exact tone, the way people's faces looked, or the way you imagine they looked in the seconds after it happened. And in that replay, a fantasy often follows close behind, one where you say the perfect thing, the devastating comeback that didn't arrive in the moment but arrives now, fully formed, powerful enough to erase the memory of standing there, exposed, saying nothing at all. This fantasy is completely human, and almost everyone who has been humiliated has lived inside some version of it. But it's worth asking, honestly, whether that fantasy is actually pointing you toward anything real, or whether it's simply keeping you locked in a moment you're desperate to leave. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to be direct about something from the start, because it changes everything that follows. The best revenge against someone who humiliated you is almost never the thing you're imagining late at night. It's not the perfect comeback, the public exposure, the moment where they finally feel a fraction of what they made you feel. Those things, even when they happen, rarely deliver what they promise. What actually works, what actually dismantles the power that moment still holds over you, is something quieter, considerably less satisfying to imagine in the shower, and considerably more effective in practice. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why that's true, and what real, lasting revenge actually requires instead. Let's start with why humiliation cuts so much deeper than ordinary hurt, because understanding this distinction matters enormously for everything that follows. Ordinary hurt, a disagreement, a disappointment, even a betrayal, tends to exist primarily between you and the person who caused it. Humiliation is different, and it's different specifically because of the audience. Humiliation requires witnesses, real or imagined, and its damage comes not just from what was said or done, but from the sense that your value was reassessed downward in front of other people, or in front of your own internal sense of how others must now perceive you. This is why humiliation lingers so much longer than a private insult ever would. It's not just an event, it's a story you now believe other people are carrying around about you, whether or not that's actually true. This is worth sitting with directly because it explains something that confuses a lot of people trying to move past a humiliating experience. Why logical reassurance rarely helps as much as it should. Someone tells you, correctly, that everyone forgot about it within a week, that nobody actually thinks less of you, that you're the only one still carrying the weight of that moment. And this is almost always true. But it rarely produces relief because the actual wound isn't really about what other people currently think. It's about what you now believe about yourself, a belief that got installed in that specific moment and has been quietly running in the background ever since, regardless of whether anyone else remembers the incident at all. This is the first and most important reframe worth understanding before we talk about revenge at all. The person who humiliated you didn't actually damage your reputation in any lasting way, in the vast majority of cases. What they damaged, and what continues causing pain long after the actual event has faded from everyone else's memory, is your relationship with your own sense of dignity. And this distinction changes everything about what kind of revenge could possibly be effective, because if the actual injury is internal rather than external, no external act of revenge, however satisfying it might feel to imagine, can actually repair it. You cannot get back from someone else the thing that was actually taken, because what was taken was never really in their hands to return in the first place. It only ever felt that way in the disorienting aftermath of the moment itself. Let's talk about why the fantasy of the perfect comeback feels so powerful and why it consistently fails to deliver actual satisfaction, even when, occasionally, someone does manage to execute some version of it. The fantasy is powerful because it imagines restoring the exact conditions of the original humiliation, but reversed, the same audience, the same stakes, except this time you're the one delivering the blow instead of receiving it. This feels, in imagination, like it would finally balance the scale. But here's what almost nobody accounts for in advance. Even a perfectly executed comeback still requires you to remain oriented entirely around that person, around that moment, around proving something to precisely the audience whose opinion caused the original damage in the first place. You're not actually escaping the humiliation in this fantasy. You're simply trying to win it retroactively, which means staying inside its terms rather than ever actually leaving them. This is worth understanding clearly because it reveals something uncomfortable about most conventional ideas of revenge. They keep you tethered to the very thing you're trying to move past. Every hour spent constructing the perfect comeback, every mental rehearsal of the confrontation where they finally understand what they did, every fantasy where their humiliation mirrors your own, is an hour spent still organized around them, still granting them the exact kind of attention and power that humiliation, by its very nature, is designed to extract. Real revenge, the kind that actually works, has to look completely different because it has to accomplish something the fantasy version never actually addresses, releasing you from the orbit of that moment entirely rather than simply trying to win a rematch within it. Let's talk about a specific common scenario that illustrates this clearly, because it plays out in slightly different forms across countless different situations: workplaces, families, friend groups, romantic relationships. Someone is humiliated publicly, sharply, in a way designed specifically to diminish them in front of others. In the aftermath, there's an intense pull toward two possible responses, both of which feel, in the moment, like they might provide some relief. The first is withdrawal, disappearing from the situation entirely, avoiding the people who witnessed it, shrinking to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. The second is escalation, plotting some future moment of vindication, some eventual reversal that will finally prove the original assessment wrong. Both of these responses, different as they look on the surface, share the same underlying structure. Both keep the humiliating moment and the person responsible for it sitting at the exact center of the story, controlling the shape of everything that happens next. What we haven't yet explored, and what the rest of this exploration will focus on entirely, is a third path, one that doesn't involve either shrinking or plotting vindication, one that actually succeeds in doing what revenge fantasies only pretend to do, genuinely removing that person's power over your sense of self, not by proving them wrong in some dramatic future confrontation, but through something considerably quieter, considerably more difficult to execute, and once it's genuinely achieved, considerably more permanent than any comeback could ever hope to be. Let's name this third path directly, because everything in part one has been building toward it, and it deserves to be stated plainly before we explore what it actually requires. The best revenge against someone who humiliated you is becoming someone whose sense of worth no longer requires their opinion, or anyone's opinion, to remain stable. This sounds at first almost too simple to qualify as revenge at all, especially compared to the vivid, satisfying fantasies we discussed in part one. But it's worth sitting with why this quiet outcome is actually far more devastating to the original humiliation's power than any comeback could ever be, and understanding this requires going back to something we established earlier. Humiliation works specifically by convincing you that your value has been reassessed downward, in a way that matters, in a way that sticks. If you eventually reach a place where that reassessment simply doesn't register as significant anymore, where the memory exists without any corresponding charge attached to it, the entire mechanism the humiliation was built on stops functioning permanently, regardless of whether the person responsible ever finds out, apologizes, or faces any consequence at all. This is worth understanding as genuinely different from simply getting over it in the vague, dismissive way that phrase usually gets used. Getting over something, as commonly understood, often just means suppressing the memory, avoiding thinking about it, hoping enough time will eventually dull its intensity through simple passage rather than active work. What we're describing here is considerably more deliberate than that, and it requires actually understanding what specifically needs to happen internally for humiliation to lose its grip rather than just hoping it fades on its own schedule. Let's talk about the first component of this process because it's rarely discussed with enough precision: separating the event itself from the interpretation you built around it in the immediate aftermath. This distinction matters enormously because most of the lasting pain from humiliation doesn't actually come from the event as it objectively occurred. It comes from the story you constructed about what that event meant, a story usually built in the most vulnerable, distorted moments immediately following the humiliation, when your capacity for accurate self-assessment was at its absolute lowest. In that immediate aftermath, a single sharp comment often expands, in your own mind, into a comprehensive verdict. This is who I actually am. This is what everyone actually thinks of me. This is the truth finally being spoken out loud after everyone was too polite to say it before now. This expansion deserves to be examined directly because it reveals something important. The humiliation itself was a single moment, contained, specific, delivered by one person with their own limitations, their own motivations, their own incomplete understanding of who you actually are. But the story you built around it often expands far beyond those limits, treating one person's cruel or careless comment as though it were an objective, comprehensive truth about your entire worth. Separating these two things, the actual event and the sweeping verdict you constructed around it, is often the first real step toward reducing humiliation's grip. Because once you can see clearly that the verdict was never actually delivered by reality itself, just by one flawed, limited person in one specific, often self-serving moment, the verdict starts losing the authority it originally seemed to carry. Let's talk about the second component, which involves something we've touched on throughout other explorations in this series, but deserves specific attention here: understanding what was actually happening inside the person who humiliated you, not to excuse their behavior, but to accurately locate where the responsibility for it actually belongs. Humiliation, especially the kind that's delivered publicly with obvious intent to diminish someone in front of others, rarely comes from a place of genuine security or genuine confidence. People who are actually secure in their own worth generally don't need to diminish someone else publicly in order to feel stable. The impulse to humiliate, particularly when it's deployed strategically in front of an audience for maximum effect, usually reveals considerably more about the person doing it than about the person receiving it, often functioning as a kind of preemptive strike, an attempt to establish dominance or deflect attention away from their own insecurities by making someone else visibly smaller in comparison. This isn't a claim that every humiliating comment comes from deep psychological damage, and it's worth resisting the temptation to over-explain every instance of cruelty as some profound window into someone's tortured inner life. Sometimes people are simply careless, sometimes they're having a bad day and take it out on whoever's nearest. Sometimes the cruelty is casual rather than calculated. But in cases specifically involving public humiliation, delivered with clear intent to diminish someone in front of witnesses, there's almost always something underneath it worth naming: an attempt to manage the humiliator's own insecurity by transferring a version of it onto someone else, publicly, so that the discomfort of possibly being seen as small gets redirected outward instead of confronted directly. Understanding this doesn't require you to feel sympathy for the person who hurt you, and it certainly doesn't require excusing what they did, but it does allow for something practically useful: relocating the origin of the humiliation to where it actually belongs, inside their own psychology, rather than treating it as accurate information about your own worth. This relocation is often what finally allows the sweeping verdict we discussed earlier to lose its remaining authority, because once you understand that the impulse to humiliate you publicly likely came from something unresolved in them rather than from an accurate assessment of something deficient in you. The entire foundation the humiliation was built on simply stops holding weight. Now let's talk about the third and most practically important component of this process, because it's the piece that actually determines whether this internal shift becomes durable or simply remains an intellectual understanding that doesn't actually change how you feel when the memory resurfaces unexpectedly. This component involves deliberately, repeatedly choosing behavior that contradicts the humiliating verdict, not through dramatic public displays designed to prove anyone wrong, but through small, consistent, private choices that gradually build a different kind of evidence, evidence that exists specifically for you, regardless of whether anyone else ever witnesses it or acknowledges it at all. This is worth understanding precisely because it's the actual mechanism through which lasting change happens, far more reliable than simply deciding intellectually that the humiliation doesn't define you. Every time you choose to speak up in a room similar to the one where you were originally humiliated into silence, every time you allow yourself to take up space, to be visible, to try something that risks failure or judgment, despite the old fear that failure might trigger the same feeling all over again, you're generating direct, lived evidence that contradicts the old verdict. This evidence accumulates slowly, and it's genuinely important to be patient with how slowly it accumulates, because a single instance of choosing differently rarely undoes the weight of the original moment entirely. But repeated over time, across enough different situations, this accumulated evidence eventually becomes more persuasive, more real, more deeply felt than the original humiliating moment ever was, simply because it's more recent, more consistent, and considerably more representative of who you actually are across the full breadth of your life, rather than who you appeared to be in one isolated, difficult moment that someone else specifically engineered to make you look small. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one that ties together everything we've discussed about separating the event from its interpretation, relocating responsibility to where it actually belongs, and building accumulated evidence through deliberate choice. What we haven't yet fully addressed is what this entire process actually looks like once it reaches genuine completion. What specifically changes about how you carry yourself, how you remember the original event, and why this quiet internal transformation ends up being so much more devastating to the person who humiliated you than any comeback or confrontation could have ever managed to be, even though, in most cases, they'll never actually witness the transformation directly at all. Let's start with that last point because it's worth sitting with directly before we go anywhere else. In most cases, the person who humiliated you will never actually witness this transformation. They won't see the moment it clicks. They won't be present for the accumulated evidence building month after month in situations that have nothing to do with them at all. And this absence of an audience is worth naming clearly because it's exactly the thing that makes this kind of revenge so different from every fantasy version we discussed at the beginning of this exploration. Every comeback fantasy requires witnesses. Every vision of vindication requires the original audience to be present again, watching the reversal happen in real time. This actual transformation requires none of that, and understanding why its lack of an audience makes it more powerful, not less, is the final piece of this entire puzzle. Here's the reason, stated as plainly as possible. Revenge that requires witnesses is still, at its core, dependent on other people's perception in order to feel complete. It's still asking the question that made the original humiliation so damaging in the first place. What do people think of me? Just hoping for a different answer this time around. Revenge that doesn't require witnesses has finally escaped that question entirely. It doesn't matter what anyone thinks, including the person who humiliated you, because your own sense of worth is no longer waiting on anyone's verdict to feel settled. This is genuinely the deepest possible severing of the power that person once held over you, because it removes their opinion and everyone else's opinion from the equation completely. They can think whatever they want. It simply stops mattering. not because you've convinced yourself it doesn't matter through willpower, but because you've built, through accumulated evidence and lived experience, a version of yourself whose stability was never actually going to depend on their opinion in the first place once the work was genuinely done. This is worth naming as the actual definition of the best revenge, because it reframes the entire question the title of this exploration originally posed. The best revenge was never going to be something you do to them. It was always going to be something that happens inside you, something they have absolutely no power to grant, prevent, witness, or take credit for. And this is precisely what makes it so much more complete than any comeback could ever be. Because a comeback, however satisfying in the moment, still requires their participation, their reaction, their acknowledgement in order to feel finished. This transformation requires none of that. It's finished the moment it's genuinely finished, regardless of whether they ever know it happened at all. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in practice once it's reached this kind of completion, because it's worth making concrete rather than leaving it as an abstract idea. Someone who is genuinely moved through this entire process doesn't experience the memory of the humiliating event the same way they used to. The memory doesn't disappear, and it's worth being honest about that, because pretending complete forgetting is the goal sets people up to feel like failures when the memory occasionally resurfaces, which it likely will, sometimes unexpectedly, for years afterward. What changes isn't whether the memory exists. It's the charge attached to it. The memory becomes something that happened, something that was genuinely painful at the time, something that revealed more about the person who caused it than it ever revealed about the person who experienced it, rather than something that still holds any authority over how that person currently understands their own worth. This is why, when this transformation is genuinely complete, encountering the person who humiliated you again, if that ever happens, tends to produce something considerably different from what the original revenge fantasies imagined. There's no need for the perfect comeback anymore, because the entire premise, the comeback, was designed to address the need to prove something, to correct a record, to finally win a moment that was lost, simply isn't relevant anymore. What replaces it is something quieter and honestly stranger to describe until you've experienced it directly. A kind of genuine indifference, not the performed defensive indifference of someone still secretly hurting underneath a calm exterior, but the real thing, the natural result of no longer needing anything from that person or that memory in order to feel complete. This is worth naming as the deepest insight this entire exploration has been building toward, the one worth carrying forward long after any single humiliating memory has settled into something considerably smaller than it once felt. The person who humiliated you was never actually capable of determining your worth in the first place, no matter how convincing that moment felt while it was happening. What they were capable of doing was creating a moment painful enough, public enough, sharp enough that you temporarily forgot this basic truth, temporarily handed them an authority they never actually possessed. An authority that felt real, specifically because humiliation is designed to feel real, designed to feel like an accurate, inescapable verdict, rather than what it actually is. One flawed person's attempt to make themselves feel larger by making you feel smaller, in a moment that says considerably more about their own unresolved insecurity than it will ever say about your actual worth. So if you've spent time replaying a humiliating memory, constructing comebacks that never actually get delivered, imagining a future confrontation that would finally balance the scale, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've traced across this exploration. That confrontation was never actually going to give you what you needed, even in the version where you somehow said everything perfectly and they finally understood the damage they'd caused. What you needed was never available from them at all, because it was never actually theirs to give you in the first place. It was always yours, sitting quietly underneath the noise of that moment, waiting for you to stop asking someone incapable of providing it to hand it back to you. The best revenge was never going to be watching them feel what you felt. It was always going to be simply, quietly, no longer needing them to feel anything at all in order to move forward with your own life exactly as fully as you deserve to live it. That's not a lesser version of justice. It's the only version that was ever actually available. And it turns out, once it's genuinely achieved, to be more complete, more permanent, and considerably more satisfying than any comeback could have ever hoped to deliver, precisely because it doesn't require anyone's participation but your own. And it was never, even for a moment, waiting on their permission to finally begin.